everyone, I'm Ian Norman from Lonely Spec, and today I want to talk about post-processing. You're probably familiar with some of my other YouTube videos where I talk about some different methods that I use for astrophotography that involve a method of image stacking, where we basically take multiple exposures of the night sky and then we stack those together in post-processing in order to reduce noise and increase our image quality. There's a couple different ways that I've shown how I stack photos in the past. One of those is using Adobe Photoshop to automatically align our images together. When we're shooting astrophotos, we have to deal with the rotation of the Earth, so the stars appear to move across the sky over the course of the night, and that makes for alignment issues when we're trying to process our photos. And Adobe Photoshop is one of the tools that I still use fairly often, but it's not always the best at aligning photos, especially when you're using a wide-angle lens. If it's a really ultra-wide-angle lens, the rectilinear distortion of the lens tends to really kind of mess up Photoshop in terms of how well it can align those photos. So one of the other methods that I talk about in one of my other videos is a manual alignment procedure. And while that's pretty much guaranteed to work every time, since you're going in and manually aligning each exposure, it's an extremely time-consuming process. So I wanted to go over a different piece of software that is super helpful for aligning your astrophoto exposures for stacking, and that piece of software is called Starry Landscape Stacker. And I've started using Starry Landscape Stacker in pretty much all of my stacked images. With the latest iteration of the software, it does a much better job at manually aligning astrophotos, especially those made with a super wide-angle lens. So I just wanted to give you a quick overview of how I use Starry Landscape Stacker on a very basic light frame stack of astrophotography exposures, and that should give you a good idea of how the program is used and how quick it can be for processing a stack of astrophotos.
Okay, so to start us off, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys the exposures that I took for this demonstration. I have here 19 separate exposures that I made. These were shot in Alabama Hills near Lone Pine, California. This is one of my favorite spots to photograph the Milky Way. It's right at the base of the eastern Sierra Nevada mountains. This is a relatively simple composition. This was made right at the end of the night of my shooting, just as the moon was rising. And you can see that it's colored the sky relatively blue, but one of the things I really love about this shot is that it has some moonlight hitting the mountains. And I think that's kind of what makes this shot special for me. So this photograph was taken with the Sony a7S and the Zeiss Batis 18mm f2.8 lens. This is sort of my go-to wide-angle landscape setup. And like I said, I captured 19 separate images. So if I scroll through these images relatively quickly, we can see that the sky shifts just a little bit between each exposure. So it's sort of like I have like a very short time lapse. So one of the challenges we have with stacking these sets of images is that we have to align the sky together. So my very first step when approaching an astrophoto stack is to open up the very first image, and we're going to do some very basic edits on the photograph. So I'm going to go ahead and go into the Develop module here by clicking Develop. You can also press D on the keyboard. And there's a few things that I just want to check before we make the stack. One of the first and foremost things to do is sort of give your image a relatively balanced exposure. We do this so that it's relatively easy to see what's going on. So it might be good to make some adjustments, maybe brighten up your exposure a little bit if necessary, just so you can see some details in the foreground as well as in the sky. I actually like the exposure as it is straight out of the camera. It was shot at a relatively high ISO of 12,800 with a 15-second exposure at f2.8. So this is a relatively bright image. Plus we had a little bit of the moonlight in there, so that kept this exposure relatively bright. If you're working with an exposure that starts off a little bit darker than this, it's okay. Just bump up the exposure slider just a little bit. So I'm going to actually scroll down relatively quickly here. We're not going to edit any of these basic adjustments just yet. We're going to end up doing the stack first. So the one thing that I want to look at is this detail toolbar. So something that I think is relatively important when doing an astrophoto stack is to make sure that you've disabled any kind of color noise reduction. By default, Lightroom sets color noise reduction typically to about 25%. And this can usually help a lot with a single frame, but the problem with using color noise reduction on a stack of multiple exposures is that it ends up sort of hiding some of the more detailed color data in the image. So we sort of expect some of these little nebula details to be pink, and if we enable color noise reduction, some of that pink color goes away, and we want to retain some of the natural colors that we should expect in the night sky. So by enabling color noise reduction, we're losing some of those natural colors. So we want to go ahead and disable that entirely. And as you can see, this image is relatively noisy. You can see some hot pixels here and there. The foreground, has a whole bunch of red, green, and blue color noise. It's grainy. It's not a terrible exposure, but the grain is definitely visible there. So once we've disabled our color noise reduction, we're basically ready to go ahead and process this as an image stack. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go back to my library grid view, and we can also do this by pressing G. And I'm just going to make sure that I have all of my exposures selected, and then I'm going to select and make sure that that first exposure where I disabled the color noise reduction is selected. It's a little bit lighter than the rest of these. And then I'm going to click Sync Settings. And Sync Settings will just allow us to make sure that any exposure adjustments or that color noise reduction adjustment that we made are synchronized perfectly between all of our exposures so they look exactly the same. So I'll click Synchronize. That'll paste all of the settings to all of the other exposures. And then we're ready to export our photographs. Okay, so we still have all of these images selected, so we're ready to export them so that we can import them into Starry Landscape Stacker. So I'm going to go over to the left toolbar here and click the Export button. We can go ahead and export this to just a folder on my desktop. I have one called Starry Landscape Stacker Demo. I'm not going to rename the files or anything, but I do want to make sure that my file settings are set to TIFF, and then ProPhoto RGB, which allows us to do a 16-bit depth color on our image files. I'm going to go ahead and use no compression just so that the workflow is a little bit faster. And I'm making sure that I'm not resizing my image at all. I'm not applying any sort of sharpening to it. We do want to make sure that we are retaining our metadata. Starry Landscape Stacker actually uses the timestamp of your images to help it do the stacking. So make sure that you're retaining all of your metadata when you export. And that's basically it. So I'll go ahead and click Export, and we'll let Lightroom do its thing for exporting these 19 images. Okay, so once you have all of your photographs exported, you can see I have them all here as TIFFs. We can go ahead and open up Starry Landscape Stacker. So Starry Landscape Stacker is available for macOS, and it's unfortunately not available for Windows at this time. And that's unfortunate because it's really, really good at what it does. I know a couple photographers who work on Windows computers who have actually bought a Mac Mini specifically to be able to run Starry Landscape Stacker. I probably wouldn't recommend running out to buy an entirely new computer just to use this program, but it really is quite good. It's very, very fast, and it's very, very simple to use. And like I said, I use it now for pretty much all of my stacked exposures. The latest version of the software is good enough that I almost never have to go into Adobe Photoshop in order to do a manual stack anymore, and for that reason I really do think that it's worth the purchase price. So when you first open Starry Landscape Stacker, you're met with this very simple interface, and it prompts you immediately for the files that you want to open into your stack. So I'm going to go ahead and select the folder that we have on our desktop with all of my sample images, and I'm going to highlight all of the images with a shift click and click Open. Starry Landscape Stacker supports different types of frames, and it automatically recognizes these as light frames. It also supports dark frames and flat frames, as well as custom masks. But this is a very basic stack of just 19 regular exposures. When it opens up this stack, you can see that it automatically tries to find all of the stars in the image. And it's showing us a composite image right now as if we stacked the image without any sort of alignment. And I think Starry Landscape Stacker tends to look for the stars in one of the center images in your frame, and it sort of uses that as the base for stacking all of the other frames together with it. As you can see, it's detected most of these stars. And if there are areas where Starry Landscape Stacker has very obviously missed stars, portions of the sky where you expect there to be stars, it gives us this little red dot tool which allows us to manually add stars that it might recognize. And if you look closely down here, you can actually see that Starry Landscape Stacker mistook a hot pixel for a star. And so for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and switch this tool from add red dots to remove red dots, and that allows us to erase any areas where Starry Landscape Stacker may have mistaken, say, a hot pixel for a star. So now we have our image such that most of the stars are detected, so we're going to go ahead and allow Starry Landscape Stacker to automatically find the sky by just clicking the Find Sky button, and that will automatically try to detect the horizon line and create a mask so that program knows what's the foreground and what is the sky. And as you can see, it did a relatively good job here. I see a few areas where it may have overmasked some of the sky onto the foreground, so I'm going to go ahead and click this Zoom Actual Pixels button, and we're going to zoom in, and I'm going to use the spacebar to get the hand grabber and just sort of drag along and take a look at our foreground and make sure that it looks like the mask is carefully following the foreground. You can see there's a little area right here where some of my mountain is getting masked blue. So I'm going to go ahead and use a smaller brush here. You can use the same hotkeys that you would use in Photoshop in Starry Landscape Stacker in terms of just basic brush tools. So I can make a smaller brush by clicking the open bracket. So go ahead and make that brush smaller. And it looks like we're painting the mask here. So we can go ahead and switch our paint from the sky to the ground. So I'll do that, and then we'll go ahead and make our small adjustments such that the mask follows the foreground perfectly. And we'll just go ahead and check the rest of our foreground here and look for areas where the sky may be encroaching upon the foregrounds. It's looking pretty good so far. Looks like there's a couple areas right here where it seems to be encroaching upon the foreground. So we'll go ahead and make those tweaks. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. So now that we have the sky perfectly masked, we're ready to click Align and Save. And Starry Landscape Stacker will take just a minute to align all the stars in the sky, and I believe it uses a standard median filter for doing the stack, and that should reduce most of the random noise in our photograph. Okay, so when it finishes the alignment, it prompts us with how we want to save our file. I'm going to go ahead and call this SLS demo and click the Save button. And it shows us the result of our final stack. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pull that image really quickly into Adobe Lightroom. And I'm going to go ahead and select our final composite image and one of our single frame exposures and press C to compare each of them. And let's just zoom in really quickly to sort of get an idea of what our stack ended up doing to our photograph. So our final composite is on the left, and as you can see, there's a really great reduction of noise in the final image. It just looks significantly cleaner than our single frame. If we look at the foreground is also cleaned up quite a bit, but there still is the presence of some fixed pattern noise in the photograph. And I'm just going to show you real quickly how I tend to deal with that fixed pattern noise. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and open up our composite image in Adobe Photoshop. So I'll go ahead and right click and click Edit in Adobe Photoshop CC. And I'm going to go ahead and edit that original composite TIFF that I created. Okay, so here's our photograph in Photoshop. And so while Starry Landscape Stacker did a really good job at almost completely eliminating noise in the sky of our photograph, we still have this fixed pattern noise in the foreground. So these noisy pixels are pixels that didn't change between any of our exposures. There's a couple ways to reduce fixed pattern noise, and one of those is by taking dark frames or enabling long exposure noise reduction on your camera. Starry Landscape Stacker does support dark frames. Now, I was shooting on a relatively warm night, and really warm conditions can contribute greatly to the amount of fixed pattern noise that you end up with in your photographs. So I just want to show you a quick way of how I get rid of it without having to take any sort of dark frame. So the first thing that I'm going to do, since this only affects the foreground, is to create a selection of my foreground. So I'm going to use this quick selection tool. You can also get to it by pressing W, and I'm just going to very quickly with a large brush highlight my entire foreground. And Photoshop tends to do a really good job at automatically selecting objects with the quick selection tool. And I'm just going to go zoom in and kind of refine my selection just a little bit. It really doesn't need to be perfect. We just want to make sure that we're selecting all the areas that have the problems with fixed pattern noise. So after that's selected, we're going to use a filter called Dust and Scratches, which we can find under Filter, and then Noise, and then Dust and Scratches. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom in here so we can sort of see the result larger. And the way Dust and Scratches works is it looks for relatively bright pixels. I'm going to go ahead and turn the threshold down here. We'll go ahead and start it at 1 radius. You can see that at its lowest settings here, it sort of muddies up the look of the image. What we want to look for is how it's affecting those hot pixels. So you can see if I turn the preview on and off, we can see that it's trying to remove most of those hot pixels. And we want to first start by adjusting the radius, just so that most of those hot pixels are completely invisible. So once I get to a radius of about 2 pixels, most of them start to go away. We still have a few of the really large hot pixels present, so maybe 3 or 4 pixels is a little more appropriate. But as you can see, that really gives the foreground a very painterly and blurry look. So we're going to compensate with that by increasing the threshold. So this basically tells the filter to look for sort of a more precise number of pixels. And if we increase the threshold too much, you can see that it basically turns off the filter. So we're looking at sort of a happy medium where most of the hot pixels are not visible, but we still have a fair amount of detail in the foreground. I don't mind a little bit of color model in the image, a little bit of grain. We can always do some last minute tweaks to that image to sort of clean it up just a little bit more. So if I go ahead and do a final toggle on the preview here, most of the hot pixels disappear with the filter enabled, and most of the detail that I had in the original image is retained. It doesn't really seem to affect the actual detail that I want in the image. So I'm pretty happy with those settings, radius of 3 pixels and a threshold of 13 levels. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So now we've cleaned up most of that image. I can go ahead and deselect my selection there with Command D or Control D on the keyboard. I'm happy with that adjustment, so I'm going to go ahead and save my image just with Command S or Control S, and then we can switch right back to Adobe Lightroom. And now in Adobe Lightroom, we've got our final image. It's corrected for both noise in the sky and noise in the foreground. So now we're ready to do our final tweaks on the image using the Adobe Lightroom Develop module. The first thing I'm going to do is in relation to some of that last little bit of noise that's present in our photograph. So now that we've removed most of the color noise in the image, it's a little bit safer to use this color noise reduction in Adobe Lightroom. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that up just a little bit, maybe to about 10 to 15% or so, just so that some of that color noise in the foreground gets greatly reduced. Now we have a photograph that's really clean looking. There's no color noise in it whatsoever. The sky is relatively detailed, and we've retained a lot of color in the nebula in the image. And so now it's ready for some final tweaks. I'm just going to really quickly do some really slight adjustments to this image. I'm going to add a graduated filter here just to even the foreground with the sky a little bit. And then I'm going to kind of tweak the contrast of the image, give us a little bit more contrast, just to make the image a little bit more dramatic. I'm going to warm up the image just slightly, just because we're getting a little bit of blue from the moonlight. I want to make sure that I'm still maintaining a fair bit of shadow detail in the foreground. So I'm going to increase the levels on the shadows and the blacks just a little bit. And if we want to give the night sky just a little bit more punch, we can increase the clarity. I'm just going to do just a real small amount, just about 10% or so. And this photograph was shot in RAW, so it's a little bit subdued right now, so a little bit of vibrance and saturation should help. So those are some basic tweaks that we can make to the photograph. If you want a better overview of how I process photos in Adobe Lightroom, check out my tutorial on basic Milky Way processing in Adobe Lightroom. So to finish off the demo in the computer here, I want to give one last comparison of our final image with the single frame. As you can see, the final image on the left and the single frame on the right, greatly reduced noise, improved detail in the foreground. Things like the crack in this rock here are significantly more visible. The detail in the bushes in the foreground are also more visible. Noise is greatly reduced. It's just a significantly better looking photograph, and it still maintains the appearance of being a single exposure, just with greatly reduced noise.
Okay, so that's my overview of Starry Landscape Stacker. As you can see, it's pretty quick to use, and it's refined specifically for astrophotography. It's available on the Mac App Store. Check it out there. If you have any questions related to astrophotography, please feel free to add those in the comments below. And check out all of our gear reviews and tutorials and inspiration on lonelyspec.com. See ya.